Beau, to the beat. Welcome to Verdurin. I'm Pierre Delancey. A bit like BungaCast has a spirit animal in Silvio Berlusconi, Verdurin has a spirit animal in Madame Verdurin. Little known fact, her first name is Sidonie, who is a character from Proust. Who was I talking to about Proust a moment ago? Over there. You pick up a copy over there and you find out that Madame Verdurin, despite being quite possessive, manipulative, quite basic, as we say today, ended up, this is too much, too exciting, guys. She ends up being at the center of the most vital literary salon you could ever imagine. I share with her all the negative characteristics, so welcome. If I haven't yet offended you at the door, an opportunity will come. And the rest you have to do. The rest, the literariness, the saloniness, the thinkingness of it all, you have to contribute to. We do a whole bunch of things here. We do events a bit like this one. Sometimes we do events that disagree with whatever you were about to listen to. We do courses where we talk about aesthetics, history, literacy. We do symposia when we try to be slightly more clever than the academy. It's not difficult, really. We just get together on a Saturday and we talk about things and people actually care. And occasionally someone says something disagreeable, which is actually quite a lot of fun. We do adversarial book launches, which we've done with Phil. What else do we do? We sell pasta for some reason, because that seemed like a good idea at the time. We also publish books. Alex is writing one for me. We'll get to them in a second. Actually, no, we'll get to them right now, because I think this is the end of me. Very happy to see you all here. The AC is on. Please try to not perspire more than strictly necessary, because there will be limits to that machine. Having said this, I'm incredibly happy to welcome Phil, Alex, and George here, and later Lee and Nina. The kind of basic bit of Madame Verdurin will be incredibly pleased, because I've already collected my BungaCast top trumps previously. I've had Phil here on the sofa twice, George only once. And Alex has been in the queue for quite a while. So I'm incredibly happy. 5th anniversary of the publication of the book. I'm not going to sort of try to set the scene any further than that. And because my printer broke, because these things always do, and I can't bring myself to read things of a phone, I'm not going to try to introduce them in the biographical sense, because that would be quite tedious. Because most of the biographies start and end with, and he is the co-founder or co-host of BungaCast, but you already know this. I will just point that George is very recently the executive director of the Palm Springs School for Social Research, with 3 S's, very frustrating. And Phil is at King's, do I remember? No, UCL. And they have together, apart from being on the podcast together, they have co-authored in all sorts of weird Venn diagrams, all the 3 books that you can see. Well, actually, no, Phil managed to write a book of his own. So congratulations, Phil, I guess. And hell, all these books are available if you want to embarrass them or me. And what are we going to do? We're going to hear from Phil, Alex, and George in the order of their choosing. That will take about 45 minutes, and then we have a little break where you can buy more books, talk to these wonderful people, buy more books, buy more drinks, buy more books, buy more drinks, all of that. And then we'll reconvene, and we'll have some brief responses from Lee and Nina and a discussion with everyone. And doing that, I encourage you to be as active as possible. Yeah, how's that? So please join me in welcoming the OG Bunga crew.
Should we applaud ourselves? I think I do. Okay. Oh, I'm mic'd up. Hello. Lovely to see you all. Thank you very much, Pierre and Verdurin. Verdurin, just wanted to be very clear about that. And I'm looking forward also to hearing what my co-hosts have to say. We don't know. I don't think we haven't briefed each other on what we're going to say, so it's going to be a bit of a surprise to us. I'm looking forward to hearing what Nina and Lee have to say, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all your questions and being able to discuss and have drinks and all the rest of it. I'm going to just presume that we know what the end of history is about in broad senses, and I don't think there's any need to recap what has happened since we started working on the book, which was 2019, when actually, in fact, Lee prompted us to write the end of history. I just wanted to perhaps mention that 2019 was important because it was a culmination of a decade of street protest and populist revolts of both left and right around the world. Since then, I think we could argue that the return of politics in the West has been in various ways abbreviated, contained, or transposed. And by politics, I mean really oppositional politics, and really the only sort that seem to have any legs is a broad-based populism that dispenses with the symbols and ideologies associated with the 20th century left and right. And that, it seems, has been curtailed in various ways, and principally by the form that politics has taken, which is to say culture war. Left populism has left the scene. Millennials' grand contribution to world history is primarily aesthetic and gastronomic. It's kind of more dressed-down dining. I think that's basically the millennial grand contribution. So thanks to our generation for that. National populism, meanwhile, which seemed quite combustible in the 2010s, has become radical conservatism, which is to say something more consolidated ideologically, less anti-establishment, and proposes itself really as a counter or new establishment. Probably as an aside, we could say that left populism would have ended up in the same place had it been more successful than it was. So I want to make three interlinked points before moving on to, if I have time, and my co-hosts don't shut me up, the big question of history's ostensible return. But the three interlinked points I want to make at the start is firstly that national politics has become culture war. Secondly, that geopolitical questions have reasserted themselves with a great degree of intensity, but it is the realm of human life that is at most distant remove from national democratic accountability. And both these things, culture war and geopolitics, geopolitical conflict, have intermeshed in a really strange way, almost like a triumph of hyper-globalization, precisely at the moment that we're supposed to be at the end of globalization's outward march, or even globalization's retreat. So, as to global culture war, firstly, David Harvey, which we discussed his Condition of Postmodernity on the podcast maybe 2 years ago or something, he writes in the Condition of Postmodernity, which came out in 1989, I should have noted that down specifically, of a conflict between being and becoming, and between place and space. So space here is understood as something which is subject to transformation, building railways, westward expansion, to take some very 19th century sort of examples. This breeds a sort of opposition in the name of place. So right here we see already Harvey observing this in the late 80s, the dialectic between globalist creative destruction on the one hand, and in response to that emphasizing fixed place, belonging, locale, region, nation, and so on. To quote directly, the clearest form the problem takes is the shift in emphasis from historical change towards national cultures and destinies, sparking geographical conflicts between different spaces in the world economy. This then leads, and this is more my gloss on it, a certain aestheticization of politics, which is what we're seeing today. To take an example, which is actually not contemporary, it's actually the Cold War, and it's the wrong interpretation of the Cold War. This wrong interpretation of the Cold War holds that socialism was Russian or Eastern, and capitalism is a Western phenomenon. Effectively, it's a way of particularizing universal visions and occulting class conflict, class struggle. To take contemporary examples, let me just give a couple from something that I wrote a year or two ago, which are still very relevant. So in 2024, the Russian Federation announced that it would be providing assistance to foreigners wanting to, quote, escape the neoliberal ideals being advanced in their own countries. Applicants could temporarily move to Russia where, quote, where traditional values reign supreme. So if you thought that there was no alternative, that we live in the age of pensée unique, you were wrong. You can have a choice. You have a choice between Western decadence and good traditional Russian traditional values, between fags or no fags. What a wonderful choice that is on offer for us. Where politics was, the void that politics was meant to fill as it returned was actually filled by symbols. A proliferation of symbols unmoored from any meaningful referent. So you have South Korean conservative evangelicals, Hindutva nationalists, and French anti-Semites all waving the Israeli flag, while leftists hold up the Palestinian one in the name of blood and soil indigeneity. Liberal Europeans make common cause with Ukrainian neo-Nazis, while illiberal European sovereigntists cheer on Russia's transgression of Ukrainian sovereignty. In Brazil, you get patriotic nationalists calling for a US invasion of the country, or at least the imposition of tariffs, or dressing up like the libertarian president of Argentina. And then Russia, which I just mentioned, provides temporary residence to foreign nationalists without the latter needing to confirm their knowledge of Russian history, Russian language, or anything like that. So, so much for rootedness. And MAGA itself has become effectively a global franchise. So in all of this, place has become mythologized and commodified. 3 points to make about the nature of global culture war as it exists today, this strange intermeshing of the return of politics, but on a really symbolic realm, and geopolitical tension, which is very real. So firstly, national culture wars adopt symbols from the international arena. So you might adopt the Israeli flag or the Palestinian flag, the Russian or the Ukrainian flag, in a way of playing out your domestic political conflicts on that terrain. Secondly, national culture wars become something to be consumed abroad. And this is especially the case with the US's culture wars, where the particular reference of US woke or anti-woke become positions to be staked in Britain or in Brazil or wherever else you care to mention. And this is probably not just an American story, or rather a story not merely of consuming American culture wars, but also if you remember that the Ukrainian conflict began as a domestic culture war in Ukraine, which then became a strategic and military conflict, bringing in all sorts of other powers. So these matters of culture war aren't merely something that you read about on the internet or put your flags in your bio, but have genuine consequences. The third point about global culture war is that international politics, the real stuff of diplomacy, trade, war, and so on, has become a game of cultural posturing. And I had some examples about this, but I think I just probably have to cite what the US White House Twitter page is putting out, or various Iranian embassies are putting out on its feed, if you've seen this, as a perfect example of this. But whatever, we can think about Israel, Palestine. Israel suddenly emerges as a defender of Western civilization or even whiteness, while Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran stand as protectors of innocence or justice. Various kind of perversions that we could mention as further examples of this. So this is a scene which is highly confused and rather different, I think, to the one that we would have imagined when we started writing the book in 2019. So the end of history is definitively over. I kind of vainly set up a Google alert a while back for the end of history to see who was talking about it, and kept forwarding them on to George and Phil, who kept telling me, shut up, that's enough now. And I kept doing it. But some of them are interesting, some of them are less so, but from across the political spectrum, from various walks of life, people have adopted the phrase. And I'm not here to tell you should buy the end of history, not that other guy's. I'll leave that for you to decide. But I think the important point is regards the misunderstanding of Fukuyama. On a basic level, and this is something that we dealt with in the book, the usual misunderstanding of Fukuyama's end of history understands history as merely events, a series of conflicts or a series of orders, and end meaning cessation. And actually, the end of history was over before it started on those terms, because Fukuyama himself acknowledged that the end of history would not mean the end of events. So when people look to a chaotic international realm or domestic culture wars and go, well, the end of history is over, I don't think they really grapple with the depth of what Fukuyama was saying. And in the book, we tried to go beyond that. And Fukuyama understood as meaning a direction or telos, and in that sense, he meant that liberal democracy had been discovered as the final form of human government. Humankind's ideological evolution had terminated at that point. And even there, we can look around at the decay and decline around us everywhere and go, well, that obviously isn't true. So therefore, the end of history is the correct thesis. But there's a temptation to go beyond that now. And the temptation is visible in the title of this event. History's back, baby. And the temptation is to say, look at the scale of the changes underfoot, not just the decline of US hegemony, the decay of 20th century institutions, the rise of China, massive technological change, climate change, which reshapes civilization, areas of settlement, etc., and to go, well, history's back. And I want to be clear about what the stakes are in that. So what does it mean to make a choice between history's back, baby, and we're in the end of history? Because you can kind of go, well, this is philosophy of history stuff, very interesting, cool if you like it, but, as I joked, what does it mean for my weekend? So to take an example, which is an unfortunate one, because I don't want to give him too much airtime, but the grade school know-it-all that goes by the name Curtis Yarvin, though I think his real name is Mencius Moldbug. Don't correct me on that, by the way. He's the leading intellectual of the neo-reactionary right and 21st century monarchist, because, why the fuck not? So his understanding of the end of history was revealing to me, and I didn't mean to talk about him when kind of drafting up my initial notes, but then I thought, actually, this has really brought something to light. So for him, the normal history of the past 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years is effectively the rise and fall of empires. The utopian and messianic aspects that were visible in later 19th century and 20th century politics, and indeed in the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union, are just kind of minor details, effectively aesthetic differences. The truth of history is the story of empires and war. As for politics, well, for him, politics is the very basic, oldest Aristotelian choice between oligarchy, monarchy, and democracy. All big claims to historical finality are bunk, because all empires do it. An empire rises, it goes, our way of doing things is the best and final way of doing it, and that's that. And for Yarvin, he feels relieved that we can just say, well, this is just the story of rise and fall of empires. There is no final idea. Divested of any ideas of utopianism or of human betterment or creating a better society, that's all nonsense. We can just get back to the reality of history, which we are in. He even goes so far as to claim that maybe we, and by that I assume he means liberal Democrats or Britain and the US, or maybe the West, we conquer the world, maybe just because we conquer the world, not because our ideas are the best ones or because we have the best system, which is a bizarre claim because, yes, you can have conquest without any appeal of, or a better system of government or way of organizing society, but you don't have then people rallying to it, right? I mean, I guess the Mongols conquered all sorts of territory, but it's not like people were like adopting the Mongol style of government around the world. We obviously, and I here I'm taking the liberty of speaking for the three of us and others in the room, and you can tell me actually you're wrong about that, but we'd want to emphasize the good in universalism, utopianism, ideas of collective transformation, in that, whether that be in socialism or certain conceptions of liberalism. It's not all fake, as Yarvin would have us believe. The neatly bookended dates of political modernity, 1789 to 1989, represented history taken to a different plane, when claims had to be rooted in freedom. So what are the stakes here? To declare history's return today, in the face of these massive world historic changes that we can all observe, and I'm sure there's geopolitical elements which maybe Phil, Lee will talk about, I'm presuming, again, we don't know what we're going to say. But all of this, if you say that history has returned, it would be to suggest that there's nothing new, that it's merely decay and decline. To endorse history understood in that way is to endorse history in a pre-modern conception. Again, the rise and fall of empires, a relativistic view of civilization. Here we can see why the radical right's civilizational politics appear serious and history-laden. We must defend Western civilization against the Muslim other, the Chinese other, whatever it might be, globo, homo, etc. And, as a consequence, liberal technocracy looks like post-history. But I think that would be deeply mistaken. If we want to retain a normative view of civilization and not a merely relative one, then we can't deem ourselves to be in history proper, of history to have restarted. A normative vision of civilization means a concern with the social conditions for human flourishing. All the talk of distinct blocks with their own long historical legacies is nonsense, a means of avoiding the unique conditions of modernity and its crises. And this goes for, left-wing versions of civilizationalism as much as a right-wing version. So you might have a left-wing version, and I know you will say, well, this isn't actually the left, but, the left says, like Pim Fortuyn did, let's defend the fags from the Muslims, right? Let's keep the Muslims out because we need the fags to be free. Sorry, I'm being really crude here, but I did promise George and Phil that I would do that. So there you go. And then the right says, no, let's kick out the fags so that we can fight the Muslims. Whatever. Either way, this is the civilizationalism. So once again, here are the stakes. To remain in the end of history is to remain in expectation of deliverance from our decayed state, to hope for something more than just hegemonic transition with the US handing over to China, or indeed for disorder. To hope for more than a slump into a post-human high-tech future, a future in which history is understood in a kind of to have left the humans behind. And it's also to hope for something more than just a transmutation of capitalism into some sort of non-liberal variety that may one day no longer merit the term capitalism at all. That is to say, capitalism without a progressive character at all. I mean, this is what's at stake in all the debates about political capitalism, techno-feudalism, etc., etc. So to say it's the end of a history is to remain in hope, effectively. To declare the return of history is to understand all that's come before us as effectively neutral or indifferent to social systems, indifferent to the fundamental human question of freedom. History nestles back into its pre-modern patterns of powers competing largely within the same system as they did in the tributary mode of production under feudalism, whatever. History effectively is kind of meaningless. One final point and a kind of recent example which was brought to mind in an episode which we just recorded. I can't remember if it's out yet. I think it's coming out in 2 weeks, where we talked with the political theorist Corey Robin about his review of a recent book. It's like 1,000 pages called Capitalism: A Global History by Sven Beckert. In his telling, capitalism isn't du commerce. It's not, people trading, free markets, free trade, everyone gets along. The more intercourse there is between nations, the more people get along and the less war there is. That would be a real age of Fukuyama global history of capitalism, triumphant, telling you stories about how peaceful it all is, etc. His story, and this is really perverse, for him, industrial capitalism especially, but you can cast that back even further, is actually the age of violence, of colonialism, of conquest, effectively of coercion, which maybe would hold for some early modern history, but it's precisely not true of post-1789 history, which is the history of class struggle, of people's ideologies, utopias. So here I think we can see the stakes again in the shift between the end of history straight to history has returned, history's back, baby, which flattens history entirely. It's all been capitalism, and capitalism means coercion, it means forced labor, it means conquest, it means slaughter. Effectively, human history flattened into this kind of despicable vision where there's no sense of progress whatsoever. So that's why I think it's important to restate the fact of the end of history and the possibilities that throws up, rather than say history's returned and that all these big questions of utopia, ideology, and so on are old hat, and that we've fallen back into this very relativistic understanding of just rise and fall of empires, and that's all that awaits us.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Pierre and Verdurin. Am I saying that right? I mean, this is a thing on the podcast. I will get all names wrong, so I'm continuing that at least. And also thanks to Alex for reconvening the Smack Boys in person. So my starting point this evening is that history is not back, baby, despite some boosters, some of whom are in the room, and we can take issue with them. We are still, as the book says, at the end of history. And I think it is this double negative condition, the end of the end, that still determines the quality of our institutions, concepts, and political ideologies, and most of all, that determines us as political subjects. In fact, I'd go further. The double negative condition is so deep that it's starting to characterize our entire society in the form of the truest instantiation of the double negative, the modern zombie. So what follows is largely taken from a current work in progress on zombie liberalism with some colleagues Tara Heffernan and Catherine Liu at the Palm Springs School for Social Research, which launches in Frankfurt next month. Please ask me about this after, or go to psssr.org for more information. And I also see it as developing a lot of the insights of the podcast, as well as, and this is also here at the front, Taking Control, Sovereignty and Democracy After Brexit, authored with Phil Lee Jones and Pete Ramsey. So I'll leave it to all of you to determine whether I, in this talk, commit any transgressions against Bunga thought, and if so, the appropriate length of stay in the Bunga Gulag. So, by this point, I think we all have to accept that zombies are everywhere. Wherever we turn, we increasingly find that the once living ideals of our society persist only in strange undead forms. Bureaucracies that once purported to be instantiations of rationality now represent a darkly comic post-human irrationality, as anyone attempting to navigate AI-assisted chatbots and helplines to obtain even the most basic administrative assistance can attest. Our cities have become fully zombified, none more terribly than Los Angeles. The second city of the richest and most powerful nation on the planet has become a place where chronic homelessness persists alongside fabulous wealth, while opioid addiction shows us tragically zombified brains across America and beyond. Our zombie economies have been hollowed out by private equity and debt-leveraged buyouts that create undead firms lumbering on unproductively, only to eat their own flesh in the form of their crippling debt service obligations. Meanwhile, only the most dedicated shill for the culture industries would today deny that our culture exists only as a zombified parody of itself. The endless recurrence model of cultural production that predominates can only mine existing ideas and intellectual property while retromaniacally and cannibalistically looking to its own very recent past for sustenance. The absence of new ideas, as yet another franchise that should have been killed off decades ago, pumps out its latest blockbuster to increasingly bored cinema goers, is a clear sign of the hopelessness of our zombie culture. Even our ways of understanding ourselves and our politics have succumbed to zombification, while every previously insightful academic discipline has become zombified. Zombie anthropology has collapsed into complete relativism and offers no explanatory purchase on understanding ourselves or others. The zombie psychology that dominates our models of our inner selves today can only see in our behaviour a crude and completely deterministic Freudian realisation of childhood trauma. So I'm doing that to emphasise the inverted commas. Critical theory, perhaps the worst culprit, continues only in the form of its zombified other, namely conspiracy theories about everything from presidential elections and political assassinations to the most banal of cultural phenomena. Even Marxism, the great synthesis of German philosophy, French socialism and English split economy, has become a zombie theory, decayed into the new holy trinity of class, gender and race, offering no path to freedom or working class power. This sorry state of affairs brings us to the question framing this event: is history back? It was initially, is history back? And then it got editorialized to history is back, baby. So I'm going to keep the question mark there, the question framing. So I think that we are, like a zombie, trapped in an eternal present, without history and unable to recall the past or imagine a future. And I think it is this double negative, the end of the end, that mirrors the double negative at the core of the zombie. So if death is a negation of the human, and the zombie is the negation of death, then the zombie is actually that strange thing, or a symbol of that strange thing, the negation of the negation. Reflecting back a distorted image of ourselves, we could suggest that the zombie is the creature of the end of history, the symbol of our time, just as the vampire is the creature of capitalist production, with dead labour sucking life from living labour. And I think also that the zombie carries a set of deep and terrible messages for us. So to mangle a phrase, we are living in a zombie age where the wealth of our societies presents itself only as an immense accumulation of the zombified remains of its older ideals. So I think the question is, how did we arrive at this seemingly near universal state of zombification? As zombies are hardly a new fear, I think it's worth paying attention to what differentiates the zombies we imagine today from those that have come before. And in particular, what makes zombies, especially if Lukács was right, and I suspect he was, that things are best grasped as aspects of processes, that it's the process of zombification that I think is of critical importance. So, cultural imaginings of the process of zombification have gone through a number of distinct phases, and don't worry, I'm going to summarise this quite heavily. But the first was the zombie was a figure of Haitian folklore, where the dead were revived by a necromancer. This zombie was above all a labourer, cursed to be exploited not just in life, but in death as well. I mean, that's the ultimate fear. Even when you die, you have to keep working. Well, maybe that's my fear. But entering the American cultural industries in the 30s and 40s, the movement to a consumer society after the Second World War saw a parallel shift in the meaning of the zombie as to the bodily capacity for mindless toil being replaced by a ghoulish rapaciousness. The zombie at this point is no longer a figure of the fear of exploited labour, but instead becomes a particularly American symbol of the fear of other people's consumption. The American zombie of the shopping mall is a new creation at that point. In Mary Shelley's classic novel Frankenstein, the reanimated corpse was a modern Prometheus, who, and I'm going to get a Paradise Lost quote in here, who, like Milton's Adam, could ask, did I request the maker from my clay to mould me man? But the American zombie that comes in the post-war period to characterize our understanding is precisely not a creature of self-awareness, only consumption. So for this classic American zombie, shuffling and stumbling slowly towards their object of desire was their defining trait. More recent fast zombie films, such as 28 Days Later, with its rage virus unleashed on the world through scientific testing on primates, have shown us only an accelerated American zombie, with a more aggressive need to devour and faster speed of movement. The zombie is still a fear of the horde of shoppers, moving inexorably towards consumption. For the Haitian zombie, then, the process of zombification was in the hands of the Bokor, a sorcerer or witch, with the enslavement of the dead labouring body requiring bewitchment. For the American zombie, the process was initially less clear, with, if anyone's seen Night of the Living Dead, George Romero's 1968 classic, you may remember that there's it's very vague, there's a NASA probe returning from Venus that brings mysterious high levels of radiation back to Earth. That's really the only explanation as to why this is happening. One thing, though, is clear about the American zombie is that it can make others into zombies. Unlike zombification by an external Bokor sorcerer force, the age of the American zombie is one in which we are a danger to each other. Accordingly, zombification adopted its now dominant model of transmission by infection, reducing the zombie body to a vector of contagion. Which brings us to the present day. So, zombification today, I think, is not a process of bewitchment or contagion, metaphorical or otherwise. It is also not something confined to horror films. I think and pick me up on this in the questions if you don't agree, but I think it's true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be saying it. Obviously, the truest cultural portrayal of modern zombification is David Simon's great American tragedy, The Wire, which originally aired on HBO from 2002 to 2008. The Wire presents, I think, a picture of an undead society in which every institution of American life is shown at its point of failure, or in the most poignant cases, far past it. The political system centred on the mayor's office is shown as corrupt and at the point of breaking. Schools are shown as chronically underfunded and set up to fail with a series of impossible tasks, and the local newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, in the 5th season is seen as a failing institution. Meanwhile, other institutions that once structured society are shown not as in peril but as having completely failed. Over and above the heroin-addicted junkies who make up the city's underclass and who are certainly shown at times in somewhat zombified states of opioid-induced bliss or shuffling along in the manner of the classic American zombie, it is the stevedores of the Port of Baltimore that the show portrays as the true modern zombies. They are modern zombies because their industry is no longer alive, and the institution of physical labour, the unloading of ships at the dock, which comes to stand in for a whole American labouring way of life, is already over. So the stevedores, led by the tragic Frank Sobotka, are forced to do the best they can while living with the knowledge that they're already dead. So I think it is this figure of the modern zombie that is a far more generalised, more real, and more frightening monster than its predecessors of the American zombie and the Haitian zombie. And ultimately, the modern zombie is the zombie produced by the internalisation of external decay, a condition that affects whole societies. We have no sorcerers, NASA probes, or rage viruses to blame. Unless we can escape the end of history, it's likely that the processes of zombification, that is, of social decay, which we internalise, will continue to deepen and to increasingly become the motor force of social and political life. While this might seem like a negative conclusion, we should also remember the observation by some mostly forgotten scribbler that in history, as in nature, decay is the laboratory of life. It's a great quote. Notwithstanding the possibility that the dialectics of decay will produce an alternative, in a situation where history is not back, the real danger at that is basically that we all become modern zombies. Thanks. My paid supporters there. Thanks. Cheering there. Yeah, you've got to distribute.
So thank you to Pierre for having me again and for reconvening the OG Bunga group. It's great to be back. So I'm going to shift registers a bit for the end of history, or the end of history. And perhaps to identify if there is any possibility of the end of history. The end of history. So if the end of history was American empire, I think that much is clear, that that period which Alex has already described was effectively the era of transnational hegemony, and it was led under American leadership. And as part of that, it was all the characteristics that we associate with that period were distinctively American. So it was a liberal system, a liberal transnational system that was organized around the American economy, and that gradually became more Americanized, both in terms of its politics, in terms of its culture, in terms of its dominant ideologies. In every way that was possible to conceive of, I think it's clear that the end of history was the period of American imperial domination. It was the period of American empire. So that characteristic of post-political life in which everything, all the old politics became dissolved away either into ethics such as human rights or into law, the appellate court of the WTO on trade regulations, or human rights courts, or the US Supreme Court, or the European Court of Justice, whatever it might be, all these various agencies and subsidiary organs of this large political, global political structure in which all fundamental questions had been settled or decontested, so that there was essentially nothing left. It was all administrative details, ethical problems that could be left to lawyers and philosophers to sort out. There was no real meaningful social contestation. That was the period of the American empire. So if we're at the end of history, which obviously I think we are, then we're also at the end of the American empire. The end of history should be the end of the American empire. So what are the consequences and implications of the end of American empire? And it's not to say the end of American power, obviously not, but it is to say that the margin of American power has been significantly eroded. And more to the point, I think, and more importantly perhaps, that the lord of misrule in the White House has forever punctured all of the sermonizing and the moralizing that was such an important part of American imperial authority. All of that, the political persona that is so distinctively Trumpian, means that it is extraordinarily difficult to recover the position of imperial authority that was associated with that very specific cast of post-political hegemony that was the peak of American supremacy over the 1990s and over the 2000s. And I think this is most strikingly visible when Trump is at his most imperialistic. So obviously to say the American empire is over is not to say that there aren't continuing imperial expeditions that are tremendously destabilizing and damaging. But what's very striking about them is the way in which they're justified and conducted, even to the extent, for instance, in Venezuela, that they had to make up that America had a national interest in order to retrospectively justify what happened. The very striking example that because Trump castigated the globalist elite that he had tried to eject from the corridors of power, he had castigated them. He said, we never even got the oil in Iraq, so we were always fighting wars on behalf of others. So he wanted to make sure that the war fought in Venezuela was in America's interests. But it turns out, he says, we're going to get the Venezuelan oil and a lot of people are going to make a lot of money and American companies are going to benefit. However, it turned out that the American oil corporations were very skeptical, very hesitant, and with great reluctance only involved themselves in the Venezuelan expedition. And also the Venezuelan oil is actually very expensive and difficult to process, and that the idea that it was a war for oil and that there's any meaningful American interest in exploiting Venezuela's oil doesn't stand up. And then if you also think about the expedition against Iran, the way in which the US, or Trump in particular, shrugged off the prospect of regime change. He said the Iranian people have an option, they have this kind of once-in-a-lifetime chance to take advantage of the destabilization of the regime, to rise up against the mullahs and overthrow it. But it's up to them. It doesn't really matter what happens. He said he was happy to initially kind of very bombastic and then happy to cut a deal with whoever the next mullah is that's elected by the Islamic Republic. And, they'll cut a deal with whoever at the same time as they're killing the people they're supposed to be negotiating with. But the point is, there was no responsibility taken for democratizing Iran or for letting the fags get into Iran, I guess as Alex would say, or anything like that. And you can contrast that with if the Democrats had done it. And the Democrats, I don't think it's a difference that the Democrats wouldn't have gone into Iran. Hillary based her candidacy in 2016 very strongly saying that she was willing to fight a war against Iran if necessary. But if the Democrats had been conducting the war, it would have been war for human rights, for democracy. They would have committed to rebuilding and nation-building Iran, ensuring that women's rights were respected, making sure there was a new political elite in charge that was part of this new American global order. So the point being that there is no effort at maintaining America's imperial authority. And it's not, when Trump does it, it's for America's good, even if that good is phony or the interest that he claims is phony, it's not for our own good. And I think that is the key difference. So even if the Americans are still bombing other countries and still leading these imperial expeditions, they're not doing it on our own behalf, which is the way in which wars were conducted at the end of history, where you were bombed for your own good and it was to liberate you and to bring about human rights and to realize your own interests. It's rather done for America's benefit. And that, I think, is important because what's happened, what that significance of that is that the US has itself stripped away that psychic comfort, that there is oversight and punishment from above, that there's somebody who's looking after you either to ensure that they can control you and direct you and point you in the right direction, or to punish you if you misbehave. And so the result of that stripping away of that psychic oversight has exposed all other nations, all other peoples in the world for their political adolescence, thrust them or put them in the position of being political adolescents, if not outright infants. And I think that is, in fact, the hardest core of Trump derangement syndrome. More than any obscenity or vulgarity or crudity or crime that Trump has committed, more than anything else, it's this outrage when an authority figure takes away your excuse for irresponsibility. And that is, I think, Trump's greatest crime, and the one for which he'll never be forgiven, for the fear of freedom, essentially, that has been put onto all other states. So if we're at the end of history and we are in this process of decay and degradation, I think there are plenty of opportunities for people and states that are willing to exploit them. And if that is possible, if states and people are able to find opportunities, political opportunities or economic opportunities that they are able to seize for their own benefit in the wreckage of American empire, then that means perhaps at that point there might be then the possibility of the kind of conflict and competition that is associated with a historical dialectic. But it seems that at least at the moment, we're not at that point. So I think there is a whole new politics to take advantage of, which is essentially to build independent nation states in the ruins of the American empire. And at the moment, the left, the right, and the center are all defined by their transnational political orientation and their unwillingness to take responsibility for their own states. So if you think about kind of three political options that are available. So for the right, it's Western civilization. I mean, and, there's all sorts of criticisms and complaints you could make about how phony and constructed the idea might be and how, superficial its roots are and what have you. But all of that aside, its real political effect is to smudge out national interest. To claim Western civilization is a way of effacing and avoiding questions of national politics and national responsibility and accountability to one's own people. In the centre, perhaps, you have Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, who made that astonishingly cynical, though much celebrated speech at Davos, where he compared all of America's followers to the Czech shopkeepers who put up the posters on the appropriate days when they were ruled by the USSR, when Czechoslovakia was dominated by the Soviet Union, confessing essentially that it was all of America's liberal supporters were all kind of going through a pantomime show of pretending to be loyal subjects. And he offers a model of globalization without hegemony. His idea is that a few middle powers getting together, Canada, Britain, the European Union, Japan, Australia, if they can band together, they can keep globalization on the road, but without any kind of hegemony that would actually provide the infrastructure that's needed for globalization to function along the old model. So again, it seems to me a way of avoiding distinctively national problems that each of those states confronts, and a way also of trying to recreate the liberal globalization of a defunct era. And then on the other hand, with the left, you have the global intifada, which, as the name suggests, this idea of a global uprising against settler colonialism and racial capitalism, and at the further end of it, Islamist skepticism and hostility and suspicion to Judaism itself. In that model, you also, again, have a complete effacement of any meaningful sense of national improvement or even national liberation. If you think about how the global intifada almost seems to succeed in inverse proportion to the misery and degradation and abnegation of the Palestinian national project. So in all of those three basic political options, they're ways of avoiding the single most important questions, which are national political questions, in effect. And so as long as those are the options for the right, the center, and the left, then we'll remain stuck in the end of history. But it seems to me the possibility is there to escape it if there is a politics that is able to realize the national interest, in effect. So, thank you very much.
Can I encourage you to respond to one another for exactly 5 minutes in that kind of cantankerous way that people tune in for? I think that might be fun.
Yeah, I've got something to say to both of the two of you. Sorry, that sounded way ruder than I intended it to. I guess to the point to Alex would be, you seem to say that we have a choice between, in fact, you explicitly said we have a choice between the end of history and history. I mean, I guess I'd always assumed that it's sort of, I don't want to fetishize reality, but I kind of thought it's like out there, and we just then we don't get to choose. We sort of it's the context that we're in. I don't know if I should let you respond to that, or I should say, I'm going to say my point to Phil as well, and then we can go around like that. Phil, I agreed with a lot of what you said. I felt like there was a bit of a Jordan Peterson vibe, like take responsibility. Nations need to grow up, need to clean your room, the national equivalent of that. Kind of build some infrastructure, kind of.
Well, I've got a like a mic.
Yeah, exactly. You've got a self-help vibe, in a good way, and that was it. That was my point. That was it. Okay.
I mean, you make a choice when you write. You make a choice when you analyze, and you give weight to the meanings of the words that you write. So, in that sense, yes, it's obviously a choice. In interpreting the current moment as the decay of the specific and concrete sense of the end of history, of American hegemony, of the American empire, and all the products of that, or of understanding history itself as being something in which any big claims about freedom, human emancipation, etc., are kind of relativized, minimized, and history is retold as a story of the rise and fall of empires, you know. And so in that sense, that's what the choice is. Now, I don't know if that's a political choice. It's not like parties are competing between the party that says it's all history and the party that says it's the end of history. But if we want to kind of play that out a little bit, right? I mean, the radical right and its civilizational sense of politics is an endorsement, is a choice, and it's saying, yes, we are back in history. We need to rally the troops, defend Western civilization, etc. And that is a sense of reinterpreting history as if the French Revolution had never happened, to put it that way. And it's very evident in their words when they refer to what Western civilization is. It's always Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian values. right? So the Enlightenment gets completely written out of that story. I think that's quite fundamental to understanding that. So there is a party, somewhat constituted, which defends history as, you know, just one bloody thing after another, and that's fine. And there is then no party really willing to take up the end of history, or at least something which gives concrete form to that hope that one can have a politics based on expanding human freedom.
Thanks. That was a much better answer than the question deserved. Yeah, the right defends civilizational heft.
Civilization. Thank you. I'm glad someone said civilizational heft.
Yeah.
No. I defend civilizational heft.
Okay.
It's the inheritance of the Enlightenment, etc. It's the right which discards it.
Yeah, so is it just Jordan Peterson? So touche. But no, it's not. It's not Jordan Peterson for two reasons. First of all, because he's a Western civilization guy. And I don't think there is any kind of meaningful, well, it's not even that it's not meaningful, it's rather that it's a way of avoiding responsibility, that we're all banding together in this thing, which is again a way of recreating American leadership in a post-liberal form, but by which everybody else absolves themselves of the responsibility of relating to the legal and political questions of their own states, their own nations, and particularly their fellow citizens, rather invoking these, you know, very artificially confected cultures. So Jordan Peterson is a Western civilization guy, but also, in as much as he's claiming for taking up authority, it's very much at the individual level. The idea, you know, you tidy your room, take responsibility for yourself, man up. It's an existential politics cast at the level of the individual, and a lot of it is stylistic. You know, a lot of it is kind of adopting a certain kind of posture or style that will supposedly motivate recovery. Whereas what I'm trying to put forward, at least, is more about the need for collective obligation, so that the individual has political obligations to their fellow citizens within, and also the need to engage in nation building as part of that political project. So it's not a call for you know, individuals simply to buck up and walk upright and walk a bit taller, but rather to try and establish what they share in common with their fellow citizens as part of a process of taking advantage of the end of the American Empire, taking advantage of the end of this obscene authority. And then the final thing is he's a Jungian, whereas I'd be a Freudian. So that would also be a reason to discount Jordan Peterson.
I mean, you're pretty sanguine, as usual, about Trump and feeling like he's doing us a service in ripping off the mask. And to a certain extent, that's true, though I feel like that only gains its piquancy from in opposition to the Trump hysterics, right? And if you actually look at it, well, what does this ripping off of the mask actually do? You know, like how many times can you rip off the mask until you're just tearing at your flesh? So, you know, basically getting at the cynicism of what Trump does and the possibilities.
It's not tearing off a mask, though. Like, it's like the Wizard of Oz. At the end of the movie...
Spoiler.
Yes. Spoiler alert. They rip the curtain back and they see it's just an old man cranking the machines to make the holographic head and all the steam and the machinery, right? And that's not ripping off the mask. Because when you've seen the old man behind the curtain, you cannot unsee it.
Well, it's actually about the gold standard, you know, the Wizard of Oz. And so, and actually it's about the dollar. So anyway. No,
yes. And de-dollarization is slowly happening.
But anyway, because...
So the Wizard of Oz makes sense.
No, but to go back to Jordan Peterson, right? So Jordan Peterson is addressing himself to individuals, yeah.
Yeah.
You're addressing yourself to individual nations as if they're a unitary actor, right? And one can very well have a world, a quite disordered world into which we're entering, quite obviously, in which states do have to take responsibility, but they're relatively, their autonomy is relative, and they have to choose whether they're going to deal with China, whether they're going to get, you know.
But I'm not assuming nations are unitary, quite the opposite. But I'm suggesting that people need to work out what their interests are together. And within the context of the jurisdiction in which people enjoy and exercise the most political agency, which is the legal form of the nation state. So I'm not presupposing that there is the possibility for political action in under a unified sovereign state, just to say only it's legally centralized political authority. But that's not to assume that there's no differences within those states, or that, you know, you can talk loosely in terms of organically unified peoples. Quite the opposite. We need to work through what the differences are and where the points of common interest lie. So it's not to anthropomorphize nations.
I mean, we've had this discussion before on the podcast, in fact, about your book. So maybe shouldn't retread that ground entirely. Go check out the episode. But I guess the problem is that ultimately, it's another one which gains its piquancy in Europe as opposed to the EU, right? So there's a rejection of globality in favor of focusing on nation states. In many nation states around the world, that would be kind of like, well, duh. Right, and they're saying no, we do defend the national interest, and it's following the more or less what's inscribed in neoliberal globalization or whatever comes after it, and there isn't really any self-constitution of a nation or any recreation in that moment.
I don't see it. People throw these examples at me, and I don't see meaningful. And I'm happy to take any kind of examples that people might have. It's entirely possible there's all sorts of developments that I've missed, but I don't see real evidence of confidence, self-assertion, even if, there might, certain states might talk in terms of the national interest, but very few countries are taking advantage of the extraordinary moment that is the end, the Americans being the single most powerful state in human history. That period is over. And it is amazing and astonishing that so few countries have, with maybe the partial exception of Israel, have sought to take advantage of it. And even Israel has only taken advantage of it in a way that is ultimately self-defeating and irrational. And so it seems to me that though it's astonishing that that there's such little sense of political opportunity.
Please join me in thanking Phil, Alex, and George. Welcome back. Hello. How are we? Oh, God. Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. Welcome back. We're going to try to have as much of a conversation in the next hour until it becomes too hot to do anything else as we can. And we'll start with responses from Nina Power and then Lee Jones. Nina, I can introduce without notes because I've done this many times. Nina is on this sofa all the time, which I really enjoy. Nina is a philosopher, a critic. She has written for magazines like The Critic. She has written for The Telegraph. What? The philosopher? She has probably written... I'll just move on. Nina Power will speak, yes? That's going to be fine. One of the reasons that Nina is interesting in this context is that we run a course with taught by Nina called Zeitgeist, which dealt with some of the overarching questions of how we understand history that I sort of plagiarized some of her content in my closing remarks a little bit earlier. That course is available online if you... What? My God, it is literally my job. And then we'll hear from Lee Jones, who is one of the co-authors of Taking Control, and he is an academic at Queen Mary. So I'll hand over to both of them, and then we'll do the thing then that you join in.
Okay, thanks, Pierre, and thank you to the Bunga Boys, men, for the honour of inviting me to respond to them. Obviously, I didn't know what they were going to say, so this is a real-time live response to 3 different papers, and I'm going to add some more things into the ring, whilst attempting to pretend as if I'm responding to each of them individually. So on the zombie point, I very much liked George's presentation. Well, I like them all, but the thinking about the zombie, I was recalling the 1985 Romero film, which is Day of the Dead. So if Dawn of the Dead is the kind of anti-consumerist film in which, the zombies return to the mall because it's what they remember and it's what they feel familiar doing, then Day of the Dead, which is, from 1985, is a sort of slightly lesser known one, I think, in the series. And this is a world in which the virus, the zombification, is kind of endless and ongoing. The scientists are sort of bunkered down in an actual bunker, trying to work out a cure on the one hand, right? So one of the options they have is to cure the zombies, and the other of which is to domesticate them, which is very interesting. And they have a test subject called Bub, who is a sort of slightly unique zombie, who is able to recall, for whatever reason, some of his earlier human emotions and behaviors. And at one point, he's very moved when he listens to Beethoven's Ode to Joy on something like a tape recorder or a Walkman. And he seems to evidence various things like grief and revenge. And there's something very interesting about Bob, I think, for George's thesis, which I'm going to throw back to him, which is if this state of social zombification that incorporates and includes all of the kind of earlier cultural iterations of the consumerist, there's obviously the kind of racial politics also in the earlier zombie films, but we're kind of stuck in zombification, right, in George's thesis. Then what hope for the zombies? This 1985 film seems to at least hold out a certain hope for the domestication, that is to say, the rehumanization of the zombies in their nevertheless zombified state. Of course, in the film, this goes horribly wrong, and Bub, the semi-domesticated zombie, in an act of revenge for against his human captors, ends up, spoiler alert, shooting one of them in the stomach at the end of the film. Nevertheless, I'm kind of intrigued to think about, as we move into perhaps a post-literate world, a world that is kind of completely in decline, that is divided along all kinds of lines. We have potentially a culture that can provide everything that everyone already likes, and they can immediately create it for themselves, right? To get stuck in a kind of somatic loop of the kind that Aldous Huxley was perhaps depicting in Brave New World. We're kind of at that stage now, where you can spend perhaps your entire life existing in a world of familiarity. Okay, it's going to be a virtual, highly mediated world where tech companies are going to provide you with just about enough stimulation, whether it's pornographic or sort of emotional or existential, to kind of live out your days. And I wonder how we break out of something like the semi-domestication of the zombie culture. So that would be my response to George. I was thinking in all of the presentations about this idea of remaining with the end of history. And one of the things I just want to kind of throw in there, I went to see Peter Thiel recently give his Antichrist lectures in Rome. I'm sure you're familiar with who Peter Thiel is. It is, of course, very striking that this tech billionaire is going out of his way to give these deeply theologically informed lectures about the end of the world. And I wanted to throw in this question of apocalypticism, which of course is a perennial feature of human history, whether it's of a religious kind or an environmental kind. And of course, one of Peter Thiel's great nemesis is Greta Thunberg, who Pierre is very fond of in a perverse way, who for him represents something like an anti-Christic attitude, which is to say somebody who seeks perversely or paradoxically the end of the world. And we do see this apocalyptic tendency in some of the kind of environmental movements, also in the way they act. Perhaps it's too late, perhaps we've destroyed the earth. All we can do is enter into a sort of phase of mourning, of dressing up in kind of end time outfits and so on. Peter Thiel's argument in some ways is to talk about the catechon, and the catechon is that which stops the Antichrist. It's something that prevents, that restrains in the Bible the coming of the Antichrist. He thinks, against Phil's thesis, that this is still the American empire. He basically fuses a kind of Cold War anti-China sentiment, which he very much regards as the kind of the Antichrist, in the sense that the Antichrist is the one who will bring about the one world government, who will kind of inaugurate a sort of single planetary system that comes promising peace and safety. And this will be done, he thinks, through technology, through the social credit system, through complete surveillance, through a kind of totalitarian kind of dealing with human biomass. And opposed to that, of course, he wants to suggest that America is the catacon. America, the American empire, as he sees it, in its technological entrepreneurialism, is that which is preventing the one world, the global tyranny. We may wonder about this. We may wonder what Palantir is doing. He thinks that there is enough kind of antagonism, let's say, between the tech companies, between corporate America, between political America, and between the American people to generate enough conflict and friction, basically, to keep history going, which is kind of an interesting thesis. This is nevertheless still, in the terms of the discussion this evening, stuck in empire thought, right? This is the American empire versus the Chinese empire. The American empire, he thinks, has taken over from the Roman Empire. He was nevertheless in Europe to encourage the young men to do something. He was the literal human equivalent of that meme where there's a little sort of stick man with a stick poking someone, saying, do something, right? So he is still committed to this idea that there is an entrepreneurial spirit, that there is a spirit of innovation and engineering and great ideas and so on, but that somehow it has fallen into a kind of lassitude or a sort of nihilism or a sort of torpor. So I just wanted to bring in this question of the end of the world, not just the end of history, or the end of history, but the kind of apocalyptic spirit, which I think we see in many, many quarters now, whether it's kind of a passive nihilism, whether it's a sort of environmental apocalypticism, or whether it is a kind of weird tech bro theology of Peter Thiel. And I suppose finally to think about this question of freedom, particularly in the national, in relation to the national interest, someone brought up, I think it was Alex, maybe mentioned Pim Fortuyn. I'm fascinated by Pim Fortuyn. For those of you who don't remember or weren't alive at that point, he was a Dutch politician who was gay. He was very liberal. He made an interesting historical argument. He said that basically Europe, or Holland, as he was representing, had reached a certain point in its own organic history, unfolding of history, which included the liberation of women, and gays, and he said, I do not want to go through feminism and gay rights again. Of course, he was primarily responding to what he perceived to be the regressive and reactionary Islamic threat, as he perceived it, and for his pains, he was assassinated by a deranged animal rights activist leftist who regarded him as a fascist. But I think there was something interesting from a historical point of view about what Pim Fortuyn was saying was the kind of culmination of a certain kind of liberalism, and whether it necessarily had those features and how they might relate to questions of emancipation and human freedom in this sense. I think it's clear that the right has the monopoly, in however postmodern a way, on these questions of the relationship between a people, a place, a nation, history, tradition, and so on. And we are seeing a huge resurgence of these kind of atavistic claims from Restore Britain and from other parts of the right that want to tie very closely a people to a place, right? So the national interest cannot be detached from something like a people in whose interest these things are happening. This goes alongside a deep and complete abiding mistrust, if not outright rebellious attitude towards all of the institutions. Take Britain as an example, which would be everything from the NHS to the BBC to the government to perceived two-tierism of Starmer's government and so on. And the idea that the British people, as such, have been betrayed. The use of the word traitor is a regular feature of the right-wing discourse. I think it's very interesting to ask this question of whether there is, in fact, a kind of postmodern right that might be drawing on the use of history in the sort of classical sense, that the idea of history as being tied to particular people, however bloody that is, that does indeed foreclose the French Revolutionary and Enlightenment idea of a kind of collective discussion of freedom, which has a universal dimension. We are moving towards something like a kind of post-universalism, which might look like a pluralism, but one of the problems with pluralism, is, of course, is that there are different degrees of power involved in different positions. That it's very, very, very hard to maintain a balanced pluralism of any kind, whether it's religious or social or identitarian or anything else. when I was teaching the philosophy of history course, it really struck me when we look back at some of the Enlightenment philosophers, the people who are supposedly writing, people like Kant and Condorcet, who are basically kind of apex Enlightenment thinkers, right? Who are very much talking about freedom and universality and the, let's say, capacity of humanity to construct and create their own history, right? In an active, autonomous, collective way. Nevertheless, many of these thinkers still invoke the idea of providence, the idea that there was a pattern or a way that history unfolds that is not amenable to us and that we cannot perceive, right? You may think that providence has a kind of get-out clause, right? We simply can't know God's plan. We don't know how things are going to go. I think we see a secular version of this in the idea of trust the plan, which was a very popular MAGA phrase, right? Like the idea that there was, underneath all of the confusion and chaos, there was nevertheless something that was actually being done in a systematic way that would unveil all of the kind of anti-Christic and demonic and so on tendencies. So I wanted to refer back to this question of the nation, how Phil, for example, might defend a concept of the nation which is not going to be reducible to something like a people in the atavistic postmodern right position, or whether he sees a problem with that. But also about this kind of ineliminability, it seems to me, of the desire for something like providence. The idea that there is a kind of pattern unfolding beneath or above history or the end of history. And just to finish, when we think about progress, I think there is perhaps to use George's language, a kind of zombie progressivism. Christopher Lasch, in his book, The True and Only Heaven, makes the very, very interesting point that we have moved from a notion of progress which sees the end of history or that strives towards an end of history, secularization, let's say, of the apocalypse that Peter Thiel has reintroduced into the discourse. But that this has given way, the religious idea of progress has given way to something like the scientific model of progress, which is infinite, right? There can always be a new experiment, there can always be a new solution to a new problem, and so on. And in that sense, the progressive lives in a sort of perpetual present, right? The perpetual presentism of the progressive, for whom indeed these transnational causes can become themselves utopian. Because what is more utopian than imagining there are people on the other side of the world who are ideal, who are innocent, who are purely the objects of our sympathy and pity? It's so much easier to do that than it is to love your neighbor, for example, right? Or to deal with the reality of your local area or your country or your city and all of those sorts of things. So there is a kind of utopianism built into that progressivism in the transnational fetishization, let's say. And I wondered just briefly what you all thought of Anton Jaeger's hyperpolitics thesis, which you're probably all familiar with. Me and Pierre went to see the launch of his hyperpolitics book, in which he seemed to be mourning the absence of a Leninist organization, but in many ways making a kind of similar argument about the sort of becoming spectacle of politics, right? The fact that culture war itself is what politics is. It's everything is symbolic, but these symbolic positions obviously have real material consequences. So yeah, I will leave it there.
That's a very hard act to follow. I'll try to be brief because I'm keen, we're all keen to opening up to all of you. I was very struck by George's talk about zombies and the line that zombification involves an inability to recall the past and an inability to imagine the future. And I think that's very true. If I think about the first problem, an inability to understand the past, Alex mentioned that I urged the Bunga Boys to write this book. Why did I do that? I was teaching from 2017 a course called Politics at the End of History, which I created because my undergraduate students turned up to class on the day after Trump's victory and evinced fear. That was their response to a political development. This is politics students, third-year undergraduates. They had nothing but fear. Americans are racists. Americans are fascists. I thought, we're clearly letting these students down. So I tried to create something that would try to help them understand the breakdown of the neoliberal order. What was the pedagogical problem? For students at the age of 21, you're trying to get them to understand that there was some form of politics that existed in the past when all they knew was the age of post-politics. And that was now breaking down. And that was frightening, but it was intelligible. And you could understand it rationally. Now the problem has changed. Less than 10 years on, my students don't remember the era of post-politics. They only remember the breakdown. So I'm now having to teach them the age of politics, the age of post-politics, and then the breakdown, right? And so we do live in this kind of era of the perpetual present in which really understanding what the historical legacy has been, what is our situation within it, is, I think, incredibly difficult. And it just gets more difficult as time goes on. The inability to imagine the future kind of sums up what all of you are talking about, this idea that we're stuck. And as you say, that's very different from when we sort of all embarked on trying to think about the breakdown of the neoliberal order from 2016 onwards. It seemed so kind of rapid that there was a kind of, I don't know, war of movement going on, that this was going to lead to something else. We didn't quite imagine that it would get stuck. But that is how it has unfolded, and we are indeed stuck. Why? I think if we think about it in the sort of longue durée that Alex sketches out, we know that 1989 was the absolute nail in the coffin of the organised working class and therefore of left-wing politics. But I think we could also think that it could be the nail in the coffin of the bourgeoisie as a political force too, in that the outcome of the Cold War, the great confrontation between these two contending forces of modernity that produced historical progress, is what Marx had predicted, the mutual ruination of the contending classes. Yes, the material interests of capital were secured by the shift to neoliberalism, but the political interests were not necessarily secured for the long haul. What we see today is the capitalist class stripped of its historical antagonist, unable to articulate a vision for society, unable to make concessions to an organized opponent, unable to forge a new stable social order, unable to control the parties that are now flourishing in the void. We only have to look at the insane imperial adventures in Venezuela and Iran to see how divorced the American government has become from American capital. The very companies that Trump claims to be advancing the interests of are not interested. So these are capitalist interests that have lost control of the Republican Party, the traditional party of capital, and have lost control of the direction of the American government. And so the result of this mutual ruination in political terms, if not economic terms yet, is that people are, as you've all pointed to, stuck in this pattern of repeating and clinging to the past, trying to repeat the poetry of the past, particularly that era of American hegemony that is now dying. I was struck, as Alex has talked about in his essay on this in 2020, the way the so-called left responded to the murder of George Floyd, and we had a globalized Black Lives Matter movement. I was struck by the weirdness of their performative repertoire. Talk about redlining, which is an American practice of urban zoning to discriminate against black people, which doesn't exist in the United Kingdom. The slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot," in a country where the police are not routinely armed. That the UK had become culturally and politically, because of the dominance of culture wars, the 51st state. And so the left was speaking in this transnational but ultimately American mode of thinking and of being, which really didn't connect with the realities of the country that they inhabited. But now the right is doing exactly the same thing. So if we think about Reform UK, to stick with the British case, they're determinedly taking their cue from the American culture wars, from the weird gyrations, the death rattle, perhaps, of the American Republic. They're determinedly pro-Israel, because that's the position of the evangelical-oriented American right, despite the fact that most of the British public actually is sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. When they started winning local governments in this country, they decided to embark on a process of doging local government, copying Elon Musk, believing that local government was awash with cash, and all you needed and all you needed to do was take down the gay pride flags and cut the DEI, not EDI, by the way, because EDI is the British acronym. Even the American acronym is imported. All you need to do was cut that, and we'd be fine. Then you'd be able to do tax cuts. When they come into government, of course, they realise that local government has had massive austerity drives. There's nothing left. Every penny has been spent on statutory obligations, and they have to put council tax up. Likewise, their first instinct is to flock behind Trump to support the insane war in Iran. The war in Iran is obviously more insane than the war in Iraq, despite the fact that it's grossly unpopular with the UK public. So these are the right-wing populists today are more oriented to what's going on in Washington, D.C. than they are to the people that they claim to represent. So the mentality is still weirdly oriented, as Phil was talking about, to this dying age of American globalist domination. And I think I completely agree with Phil that it is animated by a fear of freedom, a fear of facing up to the real conditions that we face today. And so I think we need a declaration of independence. We need a declaration of independence from the end of history and from the American culture wars. And that will allow us to reckon with sober senses the real conditions that we face today. I do think the other big related reason why we are stuck today is the absence of any serious thinking about alternative political economy models. I know I would say this, but I think it is true. Ultimately, all sides are still stuck in a decaying neoliberalism with no ideas about what we might do differently. We all live under the tyranny of the bond markets. Everybody from the Greens to Reform UK are all preaching the doctrine of fiscal discipline. If it's true, as Alex said, that the age of history was about contention over competing visions of freedom, then maybe it's freedom that we need to bring back into our conversations today, because it is strikingly absent. We never hear the word freedom uttered by any political actors today. We need to ask, what would it mean to be free? What would it mean to be free of American coercion? Because we are dangerously exposed to the coercive behavior of a dying empire. What would it mean to be free of the tech oligarchs and their dehumanizing plans for us all? What would it mean to be free of material necessity? And we need to understand that this freedom is not a neoliberal freedom, because our freedom can only be achieved collectively. So what would it mean to pursue our freedom together? Thanks.
Thank you very much for these fantastic responses. Let's get as many contributions from you as we can. May I see some hands? Do I know how to paste this? May I see some more hands, more of you than two want to say things? Okay, brilliant. Let's start. Daniel, would you mind dealing with the mic while I deal with something else? And let's maybe take two contributions at a time, and then how this plays out here, we'll have to play by ear, I guess.
I thought all your contributions really interesting, but I think one question we have to face is this could get much worse before it gets better, and it's possible that it could get much, much worse. One of you mentioned the popularity on the right with talking of things like the Roman Empire and ancient Greek empires, because that doesn't have to deal with the French Revolution and obviously ideas of the Enlightenment. But it is true that the end of the Roman Empire was a disaster for Europe. And the Middle Ages, we're not meant to call it that any longer, but it really was the Dark Ages. Sometimes when people discuss AI today, we get the feeling that we are just going to be faced. I sort of feel that, what's his name, Dr. O's point about the enshittification of everything has a lot of fact to it, that is what our experience, the enshittification of the internet, the enshittification of just getting a Wi-Fi signal or an internet signal, or getting the trains to work, or getting houses built, or motorways constructed, or railways constructed. The sort of endless list of current failures. Are we just going backwards? And if we're going backwards, what ideas do we have? You know, surely I think Lee and Phil are trying very hard to come up with ideas that we can use to sort of push us back in the other direction. But getting those ideas to take hold is very difficult.
Thank you for all the contributions. So I think my question is, given that we're speaking about history, the date most often mentioned in all of the contributions was like 1989. And obviously I understand why, because it was the fall of the Soviet Union and so on. But someone said, I think it was you, that 1989 maybe was the mutual fall of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and so on. But what if that happened much earlier? What if it happened in many ways, that could have been diagnosed after World War I, right? Like there was one desperate attempt by allegedly the proletariat to grab power in the world, and they failed. And the bourgeoisie kind of self-immolated in World War I. And after that, we had a very different type of state than we had before. That seems to be reigning ever since. So whatever condition we're in, I'd argue maybe it started much, much earlier, like 100 years ago, and actually nothing happened ever since. Except various crises of capitalism and various reconstitutions of capitalism, one of which was like Fordist, Keynesian, whatever you want to call it, and then neoliberalism, and now we'll have a third thing. And I don't think we're stuck, really. I think we're, like, post-neoliberalism, I think, is clearly formulating. In a Substack article that no one's ever read, I called it soft fascist mission economy, because it's kind of soft fascism because people love identity again, and it's mission economy because people are like, oh, we can't actually imagine to control the economy in the same way Clement Attlee did, but we can set missions like going to the moon or like building whatever number of houses or whatever. And it's kind of happening, I think, across the board, and it has its left-wing and right-wing varieties, but I do think it's kind of emerging. And for example, also in the victory of the new Hungarian prime minister, which of course is a very provincial point of me to make, I think he kind of embodies, and there was a great meme about it, kind of a second wave populism that gives up the culture war and just focuses on substantial issues and so on. And maybe that's in the same way Viktor Orban was the sort of pre-image of populism, maybe Péter Magyar is the prefiguration of post-neoliberalism, and we'll just keep going, and we'll have the 2020s will suck, but the 2030s will have another economic boom, and, nothing has happened since 1919 or 1924 or, whatever. So what do you think about, 1917 as opposed to 1989? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Look, I mean, if there were state projects to go to the moon and to build houses, that would be a good step forward. I feel you're a bit too optimistic about the current political scene. I think things might get worse, and I think we have to understand both decay and decline, because they're different, and there's not really fixed definitions, but I'll advance my own, which is that we are dealing with decay in terms of the decay of the 20th century institutions, which we know so well, whether it's kind of the rational bureaucratic state, it's people forming themselves into political parties, it's the role of journalism and the media we could continue. Even the role of the university, perhaps. And probably if I pause for a second, I'll come up with several other examples of the decay of various institutions that we're dealing with. And then there's a sense of normative decline, that fundamentally things are getting worse in terms of just the basics of human existence or the human betterment, that things, some sense that there's a trajectory towards even what was taken for granted in the post-war era in North America and Western Europe, that, well, it's a bit boring and so we should revolt, but fundamentally, life kind of improves even if things become increasingly commodified. Which is why, incidentally, you have this meme today where it's like Gen Zers looking back at Gen Xers and Boomers who complained. I think the example is always American Beauty. It was like, hang on, he had a house, he had a job, everything was fine, and that was the worst thing he could imagine. Yeah. If only we had that. So that itself, I guess, is testament to a decline of expectations as well, where a steady job, a steady house seems attractive. The alternative vision there is one of total autonomy, right? It's the platform economy. No, I don't want a fixed job because that will tie me down. I'll just hustle, and the hustle as the ultimate aspiration. And perhaps that's the kind of thing that Peter Thiel speaks to. I find it's like, is he just looking in a mirror when he writes the thing about the Antichrist? Because is what he's saying about China not just the same things that Palantir advances, albeit in a more rational and governed form? This would be Peter Thiel, but in the integument of the national interest. That's China right there. Provocation for Phil. But right there, I find that in his ideas, you have that engineering mindset, the idea of things just to be, or as people, as objects, as a problem to be resolved. And I don't see how his version of the right's proposals differ in any substantial way from the reality of Chinese surveillance and government. Well, yeah, that is true. Albeit, again, it's the thinnest last resort of freedom. If we talked about human rights as the last utopia, which it perhaps was in the 90s and 2000s, the last utopia today is that of the entrepreneur, of the self-made man via the platform economy, in which, of course, you're entirely dependent. So ideas of freedom live on in the most thin and perverted way. Things might get worse, and both decay of those institutions and, normatively speaking, decline. And I think there's always this attempt to reach for something that will break through the fog of the hyper-real. We can think of what might be happening this very year, where you have an extremely strong El Nino in the context of a warming climate and the supply shortages due to the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. There's some very serious potential for real shortages, for hunger in many different parts of the world. And there's a temptation, I think, to look for all these apocalyptic scenarios to resolve our problems for us. And they won't, because we're still very much stuck ideologically in all different forms of escaping political responsibility in terms of the politicians and our own political responsibility as citizens to get together and make demands. And there's, I think, infinite possibilities of evasion. So there's no solution coming from outside that things will get so bad that will be the final trigger to finally act.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I'd put it more bluntly. Decay is true. Crisis is ideological. Apocalypse is ideological. We can't escape the end of the world. Things, on Sugi's point, things will get worse. We were complaining in the pub before this event about how nothing works in this country. This is what the destructuring of the institutions that have previously made things work looks like. Just I do want to return to Bob, because I found myself being quite sympathetic with Bob, this domesticated zombie who strikes out at his captor, and it did make me think maybe the thing that we have, the hope for the zombies, is that we, again, to return to Paradise Lost, like we know we're zombies. We actually can understand this. We can grasp this situation. We're not the American zombie who's just rapaciously consuming. We are actually able to appreciate that we are this created thing by this process of internalized decay. Whether this is sufficient for us to to break out of this or not. I'm not entirely sure, but I do think that is, you know, I haven't seen the film, and I will go and watch it. I don't know whether Bob understands that he's a zombie, whether he sees himself in the mirror and then smashes it or whatever. But yeah, I will go and watch it. On your point, Lee, about kind of mythical past, elusive future, I really agree. I think like we are ultimately stuck because the fundamental condition is that when the bourgeoisie, you know, this is like Marxism 101, but I think vulgar Marxism gets 99% of things right. And this one, it definitely does. The bourgeoisie beat the proletariat, but they also lost in doing that. I mean, that's a very crude way to put it, but I think it's true. I'm really struck by this E.P. Thompson article, which goes into the process of how, through class struggle, classes come to understand themselves. And this is like the building of classes in the history of England, and this, you know, he then develops this into a very long book, which I haven't read all of, but I probably have given the impression on many occasions that I have. I don't know why I'm saying this because this is being recorded, so whatever. I mean, might as well be honest.
Everyone knows already it's
Yes,
fine.
yeah.
Every listener knows.
But he says about class struggle before classes. We're now in the situation of class struggle without class or after classes. So we're a completely disorganized, disaggregated situation. But it doesn't mean that the situation of class struggle isn't there. So I think there isn't really a historical precedent, but there are some, you know, things that can be inverted, which can start to describe our situation. But yeah, there's also the point about like when did, it is always the danger. Like if you're looking for the beginning of the end times, which is one of the kind of risks, it's always like, well, what about earlier? What about earlier? What about earlier? I think though I think 1989 is a really important symbol. It's, you know, processes and things, and like the dates are always representative or like symbolic, but I just think it's a very important date for the podcast and the book, and I'm not gonna ultimately let it go. I think the Berlin Wall is such an important symbol that it does represent something, which I think then later comes back, or in some weird way in 2016, which again I would defend as a definitive date where, you know, things really did change. But that's not really a very satisfying answer. It was a very good question.
So let me pick up E.P. Thompson by way of answering some of the points that were raised in the discussion. So E.P. Thompson, famously, I think it was that his intellectual collaborators warned him away, but he became completely absorbed within the anti-nuclear radical politics of the day and came up with this idea of exterminism, this notion of civilization that was oriented towards collapse and destruction, particularly in the form of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race that, you know, he thought we were constantly on the precipice of nuclear self-annihilation through these autonomous technostructures of nuclear competition and constant advancement and so on. And he was the one who connected the idea of being a Marxist historian. He connected the idea of the mutual ruin of the contending classes would take the form of the end of civilization in a nuclear holocaust. And so this, I think, is when the defeat of the left fuses in the radical imagination with the end of the world, and that the two things become effectively synonymous. And that, I think, talking of repetition, it kind of repeats. It's the way in which the left has since been attached to the notion of the end of the annihilation of humanity, you know, now in the form of climate change, or a kind of if not a nuclear apocalypse, then a climate apocalypse that leads to the same kind of condition. And it's a strange, I think it's a strange misconception about the nature of decline, but also it's actually an important misreading of the mutual ruin of the contending classes as a thesis, because my understanding, at least, of that thesis as originally formulated is inspired by the experience of ancient Rome, when the plebeians and the patricians, the core two groups of classical Republican Rome, the deadlock between those two groups, where they fail to resolve that antagonism is exploited by Caesar, the populist tribune who balances the patricians, the Senate, and the people against each other in order to seize power. And so the mutual condition of the ruling classes is not the end of the Roman Empire, but in fact its origin. It's the start of the Roman Empire, the start of this long, 2,000, 1,500-year history of long imperial decline and decadence from the peak of the achievements of the classical Roman Republic. So I suppose the point is that if there is a mutual ruin, it can take the form not necessarily of destruction and annihilation of the human race, but of long protracted decline with lots of wars, breads and circuses, populist tribunes, terrible decadence and orgies.
At least.
But we seem to be missing the orgies, so it's even worse.
Speak for yourself.
So to that extent, I think not to underestimate that, the apocalypse. We won't be saved by the apocalypse. I think there won't be any. We won't be saved by the apocalypse. The decline can last for a very long time. From the start of the Roman Empire to its end is a very, very long time, and that decline can take a spectacular, gaudy, and ostentatious form, but it can be a decline nonetheless. And I think that is more likely. So I think the techno-feudalism is a more likely in terms of a kind of reorganization. I don't think we ever had reached a point of a new feudal society, but as a direction of travel, I think that's a much more likely direction of decline than that we end up in some kind of cataclysm, which is the idea that we can reboot things and start again from the beginning, and then we have a fresh start. We're not going to get a fresh start, and we just have to accept that. I think that is the beginning of being able to actually confront our conditions with sober senses.
I loved how this started off like a wee positive, Phil, but ended up, as Dumouriez, it was going to be, let's take 3 points from the room, and then I'll give everyone, including Nina and Lee, maybe an opportunity to comment on anything they want.
Thank you to all these great papers. I was wondering, maybe there's a way of just encapsulating the idea of the end of history as the moment when Americanization and American sort of state power, at least in a British and European context, are decoupled permanently. They live their own lives, so Americanization just continues without necessarily American state presence in Europe. We identify in American ways, we have cultural conflict in American ways, we entrench those differences really without any kind of involvement of Americans themselves. And on the other hand, in terms of American politics, I mean, this applies, I think, both from the first Trump cabinet, Joe Biden, and now the second Trump cabinet. It's a tendency of simply saying, at least to Britain and Europe, you are on your own. We do not really care what you do. You need to pay your, essentially, vassalage fees and, pay up, essentially, but no more protection, no more special status. You are your own little entities with emphasis on little. Yeah, we got bigger fish to fry. Okay.
I think the Declaration of Independence is a really great model. If we're thinking about political change, I thought it was a little bit ironic that you condemned. That Lee was condemning, the American influence on us, and then uses the model as the way to challenge it. But apt in the year which we will be celebrating, or the Americans will be celebrating, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The reason the Declaration of Independence is such a great model for political change is its temporal register, right? So which is really broad. So it draws on the past from Greece and particularly from Republican Rome and from Republican Britain, actually. It speaks in that language, but it addresses the present circumstances that were happening where the Patriots were fighting the British on the battlefield at that moment. But it also has a register looking to the future. So it has a vision of the future, and it's a vision that unites the nation. It creates a nation, right? That is their future vision, and it unites the leadership, the political leadership, with the people and the people's actions. I think that the language that it speaks is of freedom, but it's also of equality, of democracy, right? And so I think that you can't really have a vision of freedom without that kind of democracy. In the modern world, you can't have a kind of sense that doesn't bring with it a kind of a notion of equality and democracy. And democracy seems to me to be much more out of fashion than freedom is. But you need an agent, right? So they knew that they had the people, the agent, and I think that's a bit what's been skirted around in the discussion. And so my question, I guess, to you guys is, where is the agent? Who is the agent? What, who brings the change? If we're going to make history happen.
Why are you asking us?
I think this question may be more directed towards Lee and Phil, considering you're both academics and teach young people. And it's sort of about that question of who creates that change, who becomes that agent. Because it seems to me that we have a young population that only really knows restriction in the sense that in their social environment, which is incredibly moralistic and puritanical, but also only knows personal indulgence in their fetishes, whether held out online or in their personal lives. And so, with this population that is not the educated those who go to universities don't only know only this world, but also justify it or hold it sacred, this sense of restriction and indulgence. They like it, or they want it to be the case. They think it's a good case to have. How, in such a population who will go on to lead probably the future political parties, because they've been to university, because they've studied all their Foucault and Marx and whatever, and they want to go and do this stuff, how do you, inculcate or foster in them this sense of freedom and also obligation when they don't think it's the right thing to do? How do you give them a sense of agency that they want to take?
Okay.
Yeah, I can answer that one very quickly because the universities are dying. And so or at least the university sector is, that's the story right now, right? In Britain, the universities are collapsing. Even King's College, my former institution, Kent, had to unify with the University of Greenwich in order to sustain itself. But even King's College, a Russell Group, premier institution, world-leading institution, and that's not to disparage Kent at all, but King's College has got more history, and wealth, and even they're fusing with Cranfield. So we're in the middle of the collapse of the university system, and that seems to me to be, given how central universities were, and it took me so long to understand this, how central universities were to that globalized model of political economy, to convert everyone to a service sector, white-collar job, essentially, and to upgrade the entire Western world to be a kind of one enormous kind of office cubicle where the state would turn into a human resources division, and everything would be managed through this kind of bureaucratic mediation of competing interests and different groups. And that the universities were absolutely crucial to that model of political economy. And there, unsurprisingly, as that global world order crumbles, so too the universities are tremendously squeezed. And so people aren't going to go to universities. And if you already look at the difficulty graduates are confronting in getting professional jobs, the fact that, particularly with all the debt, the fact that you'll probably be better off getting, becoming a tradie in terms of your lifetime earnings, that suggests to me that there's a possibility that the universities will no longer be able to serve that model of political socialization for the middle classes that they have over the last 30 years. And so that's positive for society and also positive for the students who go to university in future, because they won't simply be, trying to be converted into the bureaucrats of human resources divisions of the future. And that sounds to me potentially a grounds for optimism.
So let me address a couple of points. So, Cheryl, your question, who is the agent? That is the £64 million question. When we wrote Taking Control, we had, I think, to blow my own trumpet or our collective trumpets. I think we have an unparalleled analysis of the state that we find ourselves in, and we wanted and we were pushed by the publisher to come up with a program, right? Okay, so what are you going to do about it? What should we do about it? And our program at the end is centered around the expansion of democracy. And I think our program is quite good. But of course, from a Marxist perspective, the question is, who's going to put this program into action? And that is something we could not answer. And it's very difficult to answer. Eve, you talk about young people. My view is that when we say young people are the leaders of the future, right? It's going to be your responsibility. You're going to have to do this. It's outsourcing the responsibility that falls to mature adults. This is not the world that is created by an 18-year-old undergraduate. This is the world that has been created by generations of people who are much older, more experienced, have a greater understanding of the world. Young people today are in a powerless state. They are utterly deformed by destructive technology that strips them of their humanity, strips them of their sociality, strips them of their ability to understand texts, and to engage with people, to discuss. This is what I confront in the classroom every day, is a deep crisis of literacy, a deep crisis in people's orientation to the world. To say to these people who have been deformed by the society that we and our elders have created, that it's your responsibility to find a way out of this mess, it is profoundly irresponsible. So we, as educators, as parents, as relatives, we have to do our best to lift people out of this degraded state that they find themselves in. And they need a great deal of help, support, and sympathy, not least because our institutions are decaying around them. But to look to them for the salvation for the future, this is a weird outsourcing of responsibility, or at best, a kind of nostalgic attachment to the spirit of '68. More broadly, we face a situation where the masses, such as they are gelatinous, as Gramsci might put it, passive, divided, atomized, without any of the collective institutions that might allow them to come together, discuss the future, formulate a collective sense of what would be good for us and what we need. There's still this, all the way through the Brexit civil wars that several of us were deeply involved in. There was this remarkable passivity on the part of the Leave voting population, a desire that somebody is going to do something for us. Despite our deep cynicism that there's anybody out there that understands and cares about us and is going to do anything about it, but somebody will do it. And the population fundamentally remains passive, expecting a savior to come along in the form of Nigel Farage or Zach Palansky. We're not going to be saved by the apocalypse. We're not going to be saved by these people either. We're only going to be saved by ourselves. Until we take responsibility for the situation that we find ourselves in and act, then there will be no agent. The agent has to be constituted from scratch. And then I wanted to address the 1914 point. So I do agree with what George says, right? You can do an infinite regress. Where did it all start? Ancient Rome is where it all started. But I would also defend 1989. I think for me, 1914 is the end of the socialist project. It's the death knell of international socialism, because the working classes of Europe plunged themselves into a senseless war, a senseless inter-imperial war. They failed to stop the war. It's the moment that the bourgeois project of nationalism triumphs over the socialist project of internationalism. And I think that is a historical inflection point from which we never really recover. Certainly, if that's not true, then 1917, right? Lenin Lives, Phil's other book, which is not on display here, but is a fantastic book. The failure of the Russian Revolution to spread beyond Russia's borders is really the proof. And then the turning of Lenin's worker state subsequently into the crabbed project of socialism in one country. But nonetheless, the organised working class and the organised bourgeoisie do survive as political forces. They're not annihilated by World War One, and they're not annihilated by World War Two, right? The period of the post-war order is a pact between these two forces because they are actually political forces that have political representatives and can come to some agreement about how social order and political order should be arranged. That was the post-war order. So they weren't annihilated as political forces, but capital strikes back in the late 1970s, triumphs over the working class, but then in its victory becomes senescent, loses its own political vitality, and this is how we get into the end of history and the era of monsters. That, I think, is the correct narrative to tell.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm going to be performatively reactionary for a moment. Okay, I'm going to be performatively reactionary. This question of freedom, as Kant points out in his essay, What is Enlightenment? That it's actually very difficult to become mature, right? Especially when everything is outsourced for you. You have your doctor and your therapist or your AI chatbot or whatever. We can update it, right? That to achieve something like political maturity at the level of the individual, let alone of the collective, is an extremely onerous task, right? And it's perhaps I do wonder whether freedom is really what people want, and if we whether on the one hand we have something like, is this not the greatest freedom we've ever known, right? We can go and buy donuts at 3 a.m. We can find someone to have sex with at 4 a.m. We can have whatever, we get a kind of idea that the freedom is the indulgence of our desire, right? This is the culmination of the liberal project in many ways, right? I do wonder if A, that is not freedom in a certain sense, in a horrible sense, right? And whether people are prepared for the kind of freedom that Kant and the Enlightenment talk about, which is kind of taking control of history in many ways, or taking control of human institutions and understanding that they're human, whatever Providence is doing in the background, there's nevertheless a kind of sense of agency of a universal, maybe stagist sense. Maybe it will take other countries longer to achieve that political maturity. But of course, this is the project. And I suppose I want to push Phil, maybe particularly on the question that I asked about the national interest as it relates to the resurgence or the surgence of nativist, in however postmodern way. What if a people say, well, actually, we want to be a people, right? And that the national interest is something like mass deportations, the restoration of our heritage and our culture and our traditions, and that that what it means to take collective agency is to take the country back, right? I just want my country back, as many people would say. And I really want to push you on this because I think it is very powerful. And if we want to talk about a sense of agency, I think we do see it in however attenuated or strange form. We see the idea that people perhaps collectively taking taking back control, which of course was the slogan of Leave and Brexit, might not look like some lovely liberal universal or an extension of the project of the Enlightenment, right? It might look like a postmodern atavistic nativism.
Yeah, I take your point. I think and it's certainly a possibility about how things might get worse. I think that kind of vision of what collective control might look like, I think, is it wouldn't be a meaningful expression of the national interest precisely because it is atavistic, in the sense of it's an assertion of a lot of it is powered by folk memories of institutions and collectivities that no longer exist. And so the idea that it could be recreated through some kind of popular eruption and authoritarian government that, I mean, there is simply the institutions for such an authoritarian government don't even exist, I think, at that level. The level of state capacity is so degraded that the thought that it would be possible, for instance, to even achieve the aspirations of, say, restore Britain or whatever their most authoritarian voters might hope for. But even more profoundly than that, I think the issue is that it would only recreate globalization, I think, in the sense that it is the perfection of the project of identitarianism. And everyone else has their identity, and we've been forgotten. We want our own kind of white identity to be recognized, culturally boosted, to have all the kind of things that all these other kind of groups get with their pride flags and special national days and costumes, and they all get to celebrate and we don't, and we want the same kind of equivalence and recognition. And it would be to recreate, I think, that rainbow world of the late stage American empire. And so to that extent, it's a dead end. I think it's a self-defeating dead end. It's another iteration of the human resources vision of government, where you have state bureaucracy mediating and competing between these different factions for acclaim and interest. So that'd be, I think, if people can see that atavism, that kind of atavism, is self-defeating, then I think that's one way to meet that challenge. But the other challenge, I think people do want that freedom. Or at least they want freedom in a very particular way, and I think that complaint is heard against human rights. So I think human rights, if we understand human rights as the rights that are the rights of the transnational American empire, they're rights that are enforced by remote courts and remote bodies over which you have no political input or control, supranational authority and transnational authority, and people instinctively revolt. Like a lot of people instinctively revolt against that sense of privileged minoritarianism that is associated with human rights. And if I think people are offered the idea that you can have rights that are meaningfully reconnected to political processes that you control, then I think that is an attractive package. You get a boost to your liberty. You no longer have all the special privileges and protections that come under the transnational regime of human rights. You get your free speech. You can criticize whoever the hell you want and the rest of it. Unlike the human rights kind of regime, which is so repressive and sells oppression in the form of rights, you can have rights and you can also have control. The deal is you have to accept that it takes place at the national level and that it requires collective commitments to your fellow citizens. I think, so I would venture that there is a hunger for freedom, and perhaps even a very classical understanding of freedom that takes the form of resistance and hostility and skepticism towards the transnational regime of rights that we've had for the last 30 to 40 years.
So, I suspect Phil might understate the extent to which these atavistic forms that Nina rightly pointed to as a risk, how in the context of decay that can actually lead to forms of state transformation, which would put us in a situation which would be rather different from a mere extension of globalization, human rights, or what about me, identity politics. I think we can even see with ICE in the United States as an attempt to rebuild state capacity in a post-neoliberal vein through the means of repression, right? And through the means of this, of an anti-immigration, ethnically nationalist politics. That would seem to me to
But it's not ethnically nationalist in the US. It's fronted by people like Marco Rubio.
Yeah, but the coordinates of race can change, given that they're obviously not real or fixed. That they can still be wedded under a form of Christian nationalism, as it is in the United States. So I'm not suggesting that this is a return of race, but that this in kind of the old form. But that desire for a sense of fixity, a sense of place tied to some mythical notion of the nation, can actually lead through one course or another to a transformation of the state to a more authoritarian form, particularly in forms in stages of historical decay that we're in. And one can see this in the periphery in all sorts of examples. I'm going to come back to that point in just a second because it's my hobby horse, so obviously I was going to do that. The other point, just responding to Nina, which is what is now, I think, called treatlerism. People know this term. Treatlerism is effectively the last basis of legitimation that Western states provide, which is to say convenience. Convenience that you can order anything online. It's donut and then sex at 3 and 4 in sequence, and maybe you can go back for a donut afterwards as well. But you can also, drive an Uber, right? Which is the flip side of it. And in certain cases, you might go and make your way driving an Uber and then order stuff at home, or sometimes it's much more explicitly class divided. There's one class which drives the Uber and the other class which delivers the goods. But this is the last basis of legitimation. What happens when that no longer sells or that no longer holds? And I think that's a very big question, particularly as regards to the decline of the middle class, the basis of consumers for this form of treatlerism. Convenience as the last sell. I'll leave that as an open question.
Can I interrupt here? And so on this question, so I think again, like this idea that there's going to be a return of fascism is just
I didn't say
or
that.
some kind of fascistic authoritarianism.
No,
It's another version. It's another version of imagining that there's going to be something familiar from the past. So I think we had a guest on the pod recently, Benjamin Studebaker, who's talked about this idea of of deeply entrenched democracy as a model. And I think that is right, that there is the idea that we're going to regress into something which will be familiar and easy, and then which there'll be kind of clear possibilities for resistance and fighting back. That is gone. So we had this conversation like with Alex. He might not like me bringing this up, but it probably doesn't matter. But like when Bolsonaro took over, we're like, Alex, what are you going to do the first time? Maybe things will get really bad in Brazil when Bolsonaro first took over. Do you have like an escape plan? And it's lucky because Alex has got lots of passports, so he can basically go wherever he needs to go. It's fine. He could leave Brazil. But, obviously it didn't happen. And Bolsonaro is actually locked up, right, for trying a constitutional coup in Brazil. Like Brazilian democracy, if democracy survived in Brazil, right, I think it's going to be fine. We're not going to go backwards from it. It's entrenched. If it's entrenched in Brazil and it withstood Bolsonaro and even the extent to which he relied on the military, and he tried to foster a coup and it failed, right? Or even like if you take the example of Greece.
Sorry, I have to interrupt you. What do you mean by entrenched? You're contradicting everything you've said so far.
Guys, it's almost 10 o'clock. No, I'm saying.
Let me do this. This is contradicting everything you've said so far.
Can you wait for a mic? Can you please stop and wait for a microphone, okay? So we do this properly so they can. The podcast cannot hear you.
No, but we shouldn't let them get away with it.
Hold him to account.
Right, yeah. I'll pretend that I'm starting now. Hi, Phil. I would like to.
Please take the challenge.
You can edit it.
We will. Don't worry.
So you're contradicting yourself because in your prognosis in terms kind of the crisis of democracy, right? You have to accept that things can go wrong. So when you talk about it being entrenched, that's a metaphysical description. That's not a political description. That's not a characterization. The fact that it's emerged historically in a certain pattern embedded in socioeconomic relationships doesn't guarantee its persistent nor its ability to reproduce itself. So I need you to explain yourself and explain why do you think it's entrenched? What are the guarantees? We know what the kind of Remainer crowd would say about the resilience of democratic system and how that needs to have guarantees that are supra-democratic. That's why they justify being anti-democratic, right? What is your prescription? What's your guarantee that this entrenchment has historic resonance and longevity?
So I'm not suggesting democracy is vital or healthy, or that there aren't tremendous challenges to people's capacity to control their societies or to have their votes respected. Or, we see that that flouted all the time. But the idea that there'll be a return to charismatic authoritarianism, which openly celebrates the supplanting of democracy or the abolition of people's capacity for multi-party selection, those things are over. And this is not my idea. I mean, this is Benjamin Studebaker's idea, and I find it persuasive with my example of Bolsonaro in Brazil, but also
In fairness, Benjamin's book speaks specifically about the UK and US as embedded democracies and actually leaves it open with regard to other democracies, even relatively of long duration in Europe, let alone in the periphery. So, I mean...
So I'm disagreeing with Alex, suggesting, I think, that the risk is in this, that we're on the brink of a possible revived authoritarianism that we see with ICE. ICE isn't the start of a fascist dictatorship.
I didn't, but that's the thing. I mean, this is a failure of imagination to think you can only imagine authoritarianism in a fascist form. I can imagine in all sorts of different forms. We can talk about this later over drinks. Anyway, seizing my own authority here to finish off my remarks. I think there's two courses, effectively, rescue or reinvention. And I appreciate our Hungarian friend here's comments. Perhaps it all did end in 1914 or in the phase of the failure eventually of 1917 to 23. And perhaps abandoning those great hopes, liberalism reached its peak in 1973 and it's been downhill since then. Or perhaps we can merely rescue a sense of modern politics, which itself died then in 1989. And we can accept that decline, we can accept that decay and start a process of rescue, right? Of rescuing some notion of the rational state, representative democracy in those places where there's still a repository of knowledge and expectation that those things should be honored and not something that happens elsewhere or that has never happened in our country. There are many countries where indeed it never has really happened. The other option of rescue is that we hunker down for the dark ages and try to keep alive some notion of freedom, some idea even of being human, because that might be what is put on the table today. I don't want to make a decision between those two, and I suspect we don't need to make that decision. They can be both at once. The other point that I would make, and this ties very closely to the points about responsibility, and I really appreciate Lee's remarks on this regard, is that the uprisings of the 2010s came as a surprise. The 2010s might be a glum decade of civic privatism, declining living standards, and so on. But that doesn't mean that there won't be some uprising again. Now, this is not contradicting my previous remarks that something will come and save us, because it won't. Because precisely what will happen will be another uprising like the 2010s. It'll be like the Arab Spring, and there'll be some sort of reconstitution of power under elite rule, albeit reformed, however it might be. It might look like Egypt. It might look like Spain after the occupation of the squares. It might look like Greece. Whatever it might be. This is the point about responsibility, of the transmission of knowledge from those who have lived through that experience and the failures of the 2010s, that we might go one step further next time around. So there will be an agent. It might not be a cohesive agent, but there will be people on the streets or people rebelling in some sense. This, I expect, will be true. Our role, not as young people, I'm not young people anymore, but as someone who has read and written and experienced these things, to transmit the knowledge of past failures and how to avoid them. And I think that's important. And then the final point, which is, I guess, touches on George's point, which is in a lot of the world periphery, the reality of plunder and a patrimonial state is all that has been known. There is no golden age to return to. There's no repository of kind of good representative democratic government, which, wasn't great, wasn't the most emancipatory thing in the world, but it guaranteed rising living standards as growth was redistributed. This has just not been the reality for vast swathes of humanity. And indeed, it's kind of the vast swathes of humanity, indeed, who in the most powerful state, or the emerging power in the world as well, for that matter. So in that situation, I mean, the best that you can look back to would be some past of corporatism, perhaps, of some modicum of mass incorporation. And even then it was under very authoritarian forms, kind of mid-century dictatorships, who often did this against communism, not in its name or in the name of socialism, let alone liberalism. And I think that would be the reality which is coming for all of us, as those repositories of knowledge, of memory, of what representative democracy, of what growth, of what redistributed growth actually looked like, do the zombies die off then? We're not even left with zombies. I'll leave George to evaluate the appropriateness of that metaphor or not. But that would then lead me to tend towards the latter conclusion of reinvention, not so much rescue, but of kind of reinventing what freedom might mean, and indeed even what being human might mean, because for the first time in human history, perhaps, that question is put on the table in a very explicitly political form. And I'm a little bit heartened by the way that people are responding to AI and so on, and restating what it means to be human.
I have a lot to say in response to Alex and to the other excellent questions, but maybe we could do that over a drink and continue the conversation both here and on bungacast.com. All subscribe, join our Patreon, and wrap it up.
George, thank you. Gosh, you're saving me quite an ungrateful job. Thank you, all of you, Phil, Alex, George, Nina, and Lee. Thank you so much for being here, for your contributions.